first, Lifeline infrastructure, water, power, comms, transportation, etc. They don't really get a lot of discussion in common day speak, except of course if you're talking about, hey, the traffic was annoying or something like that. But the second something goes wrong, it's the topic of everyone's conversations, it's top of everyone's minds, and with good reason. It is important to public safety. When things go wrong, economic activity is halted. It can cause instability in communities and lower trust in institutions. So getting these Lifeline infrastructure working reliably and resiliently is really important. The challenge, of course, today is that a lot of our infrastructure is aging, it's crumbling, we all know that, we've seen all of the grades, but it's also increasingly interconnected. It's also being used in ways that we never imagined when it was built. We're also dealing with tighter budgets, and also the regulatory constraints continue to make things challenging. Additionally, infrastructure does not operate in silos, and there's been some really good discussions at the conference so far about that. So oftentimes the planning and funding and regulations do occur in silos, so it's just about water, it's just about transportation, but we know power affects the ability for water to move. We know that comms affects our ability to communicate during emergencies and crises. But again, the investment is often only made in one of these silos. So there's going to be some good discussions about that today and throughout the conference about how we can go away from some of these silos because this can make it really hard for investment to flow. And then just one other thing I want to state is, there is a very important distinction between what reliability and resiliency is. So, reliability is, how well does this thing function under normal times? And it's an important parameter that we, put in all of our specs and this and that. But resiliency is, how is that piece of equipment, system, process going to handle when it's not in normal situations? And how quickly can we get it back online? So that's just another term that, again, I think everyone is aware of, but it's so critical to these conversations today. I just wanted to spell out. So our main objectives here are to lay out some best practices to strengthen resiliency. We're going to talk about the barriers and challenges to investment. And then we're going to talk about building the defensible case for investment. So what are those economic and societal values for resiliency that we can push to make things move? And then at the end of this discussion, we've heard over the last couple of days about, how do we move things forward? And so we're going to do like a quick call to action for each of our panelists to talk about what is things that we can take from these discussions and move forward. So we want to keep this conversation about resiliency steady. Like we always want to be talking about it, but we don't want to have the same conversations here today next year. It has to be about how we're moving the needle forward and how we're doing pilot projects and this and that. So that's our goals, and I'm going to have Jordana start us off talking a little bit about her experience and AECOMs with best practices to strengthen resiliency.
Great, thank you, Eric. So I'm going to talk in terms with a perspective from disaster resilience. So that's where I'm coming from. And lifelines, as we talk about them, they're the backbone of community stability. And so power, water, transportation, and communications are all interconnected systems. And so the goal shouldn't only be to repair them after disaster, but we need to be thinking about ensuring service, continuity, and faster stabilization when systems are stressed beyond the norm. Eric touched on reliability versus resilience. So it's really thinking about when we're at our worst days. So you really need reliability and you need resilience. A system can be reliable day to day and still catastrophically fail when it's not resilient. So this whole systems approach that we're going to be talking about today helps us design for continuity and not just the individual asset performance. So the question always becomes, okay, so how do operators justify the smarter, more resilient investments and prove that they're really worth it? So I'm going to talk in terms of a couple best practices or strategies, and we'll kind of bring those three themes throughout the conversation today. So first and foremost, we need to prioritize the crucial service outcomes, not just the assets. And what I mean by that are, what are those cascading effects? We need to be focusing on protecting the assets that preserve most critical services. So think in terms of public safety, health, continuity of operations, and economic activity. A couple examples, think in terms of electric supply to water and wastewater pump stations, looking at power and access routes and how those connect to hospitals or help with emergency operations, looking at the key corridors and transportation routes that help repair crews get access or emergency operations get through. And how those strategies work is really helping decision makers invest where failure has the highest consequence. And that's what we want to be thinking about, not just in silos. Second strategy I want to talk about is reframing resilience investments into outcomes decision makers are already thinking about, what they're already tracking. So for example, if we were to pitch a flood hardening project as resilience, instead we would frame it in terms of protecting power or water systems or hospitals, or changing the narrative. We want to think in terms of reducing recovery times. These are metrics that operators are already thinking about or decision makers are thinking about, from weeks to days. How do you reduce that? That's all about resilience. Maintaining service levels during extreme events. How are we bouncing back after an impact? And so this helps align resilience with the existing approval and regulatory frameworks that decision makers are already thinking about. That's the second strategy. Now, a third strategy is to think in terms of integrating resilience with routine capital maintenance planning. So instead of treating resilience as a separate program, you're integrating it more into the existing programs. So for example, elevating or hardening assets when they're already scheduled for replacement, or incorporating future hazard conditions into design standards for standard upgrades. And how that works is thinking of how this reduces the incremental costs and avoiding those special projects that are much harder to fund. So the system can be highly reliable, again, and still fail catastrophically if it's not resilient. And that's the thing we want to make sure we're bringing home today. The strongest infrastructure programs integrate reliability and resilience at the same time. Reliability keeps services running on the good days, and resilience demonstrates whether communities can function on their worst days. So the solution isn't just better analysis. We want to be helping clients align resilience with how decisions are actually made, funded, and measured. So I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, really, really interesting. And to build off of that, Michael, can you talk a little bit more about your experience with best practices, and also touching on a little bit more about like the investment prioritization that you've experienced at Edison?
Yeah, so echoing, what Jordana said, we talk about keeping the lights on day to day is that reliability side, and resilience is, are they going to be able to turn on the worst day? And so what we've done with Southern California Edison as far as best practices is a multi-pronged approach, not just focusing on the mitigation efforts. We're very heavy in mitigating against wildfire risk as well as our seismic risk. And that comes from the top down, what's great. And, coming from the public sector side, I was with the San Bernardino County Office of Emergency Services, and then also with Orange County for over 20 years. And then coming to the private sector is seeing that commitment from leadership. We have our company goals, and they just re-emphasized, our number one company goal is safety and resiliency. Specifically in that wildfire area, also in cybersecurity are two of the focuses that we have. But how we do that, in addition to the mitigation efforts that we take, in addition, we look at it comprehensively. And so it's not just the actual hardening of our grid, but we look at the whole program, which includes our planning. I'm very operational for what I do in our business resiliency. And so developing our all hazards plan, our earthquake plan as well. and then training and exercising our employees for those types of events on a regular basis, and that is across the company. Not only our incident management teams, but our senior leadership as well, our crisis management council. And the importance of that is we could do all the hardening that we do, but is looking at some of those interdependencies that Jordana talked about. What happens when we have those cascading effects, when those interdependencies are affected, working with our public safety partners and ensuring that that we're able to navigate a major incident when it occurs. And so in addition to the mitigation efforts, we do very heavily on the planning side as well as the training and exercise side. And that really is what makes our program as effective as it is. Partnering and breaking down those silos ahead of time is key as well. It's great to see some familiar faces here, California Utilities Emergency Association as well. And then one effort that we have that we've received very strong backing from our leadership is revitalizing our Southern California Critical Lifelines work group, which is a work group made up of our public-private partnerships. So not just the public agencies, usually the offices of emergency management, but also other utilities, telecom, water, wastewater, electric. We even have participation from the ports, seeing the transportation, the importance of supply lines and supply chain after a major disaster. So those are some key things that we've done to really institute and as Eric mentioned, just continue moving the ball forward.
Thanks, Michael. And I think when I hear hardening, my mind immediately goes to like a bomb-proof system. And it also reminds me of Sheriff Don Barnes' discussion yesterday and tying it towards national security. And, we heard Hannah in her intro kind of mention this, but I'm hoping you could elaborate a little bit more on kind of the silos that you're breaking down with your military partner and how we could replicate that as like a best practice.
Certainly, thanks. Well, the idea behind the resiliency study, as we're calling it right now, that we've been working on with the California Governor's Office of Emergency Services and with various military partners in California. The idea really driving it is that if you look at our critical systems, water, energy, transportation, the military really needs to use those, especially like during certain events. But we as state agencies own and operate a lot of that, and we don't typically think about the use for national security or the importance of that. And we don't even always connect enough with our military partners. So we started thinking about, well, how can we be more proactive? And so what we did, and my area does a lot of work to do like climate modeling and adaptation work. But for this study, we looked at 4 areas of concern: man-made events, blasts, power outages, and cybersecurity concerns. And we're trying to understand what are the potential impacts to our system and what are our mitigations. And those could be like hardening infrastructure, or they could be refining responses. But when we started putting boundaries on the geographic focus areas of our study, we met with like the Marines, the Navy, the Army, the Air Force to see, okay, we know from our perspective, based on volume, based on what services they're supporting, like what Jordana was saying, what we think is critical for the state. But military, what areas are especially critical for you and your operations? And so we looked at that together and incorporated their needs, and we kind of narrowed it down to a few focus areas in the state where we own infrastructure that is also really critical to various military branches. And then, so our next step is we're actually putting out an RFP for that soon. But our next step is to work on identifying those impacts and mitigations, and maybe making a micro simulation of some of those areas, and then just trying to strengthen our partnerships with the military. we've been participating in exercises with them, like the Semper Duris Marine Corps exercise that's going to happen in April. And maintaining those partnerships is really critical because it just helps you think more proactively. So I guess my takeaway is we need to think about our systems together as a whole and try to partner with the other people who also need them. And one more example is that we're trying to figure out how to do a microgrid in an area where we could even share energy with partners around us to see how we could practice that idea of supporting multiple systems through one place. So yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks. And just a really quick follow-up on that. So I think you said 2024 is when this kind of kicked off. I mean, that's not a long time. So it feels like things moved pretty quickly. Was it difficult to get those relationships formulated? And was it co-funded? Like you guys did your own, they did their own, or how did that work?
Yeah, surprisingly, the military was so interested in partnering with us, like all the branches. We got a lot of interest from them. They've met with us at our office more than once, different branches. And the funding is a grant that we applied for our own Caltrans research funds, just under $1 million. And then the military actually has their own grant funding for some similar work. And so we're partnering with those people through the Governor's Military Council. But so right now it's like in 2 buckets of funding, and we're working together.
Thank you. And yeah, I think that the funding is so critical to all these. We can have really good ideas and an idea for a partnership, an idea for a project, but Scotty, I'm hoping maybe you could talk a little bit more about the investment piece and what are some of these challenges, obstacles to funding resiliency and making that defensible case.
Thank you. If you heard my comments about insurance, we talk before and after crisis, right? So I'm kind of focusing on the before the crisis, and you leave it to George Gushka to quote Plato in his opening remarks, that you're in one of 2 states. You're either in growth or decay. And construction is very much like a life, right? It's terminal at day 1. So we put our infrastructure in and it starts decaying over time. And so when you think of it as from terms of life, Dr. Peter Attia, in his book Outlive, talks about longevity. And so if you want to be 75 years old carrying a bag of groceries up a flight of stairs, that at 30 and 40 years old, you need to be carrying 60 pounds up 4 flights of stairs because it's going to continue to decay. The same thing applies to our infrastructure and how we maintain it. So we go from longevity to reliability and infrastructure, and we don't have the money, right? We don't have the money we need. We need to do this maintenance. We need to do this upgrade. But we do get the money in times of crisis. So there's just a political, philosophical, fundamental shift, right? We don't get the money we need to prevent, but we do get the money we need when people die, there's no power, there's no water, and the road is washed out. And not to say that, as Sheriff Barnes talked about, complacency. It's not that we're complacent, but we kick the can down the road. The water line still works. The power is still sustainable. We have a few more outages, but we fix it. We put Band-Aids on it. So then, I love analogies, obviously, with the human relationship. You put a water line in. You go put a 12-inch water line in at $250 a foot, whatever it is. And then you go put in a valve that's $4,000, $5,000. And 8 years later, there's an emergency that happens, and you go out to shut the valve off, and what happens? It's frozen. So first of all, we spent extra money to put the valve in rather than just the line. And then when it freezes, we're going to go spend 10 times the amount of money in a time of emergency to dig it up, replace it, and get the water turned off. And I think we saw that, and I don't know the specifics of DPW, but you heard them talk about isolating it, and they had to isolate it house by house. I'm guessing that they were able to shut it off in certain places, but they didn't have the entry to the neighborhood valve operational where they could start shutting these things down and pressurizing them. So in looking at that, in how do you invest, how much would it have cost to have the maintenance guy? And not saying that they didn't want to, but they didn't have the time, they didn't have the staffing because they got cut on their budget to go out and exercise all the valves along route whatever every 6 months, every 2 years, whatever their maintenance schedule is. So that's kind of the initial investment part of it. And NIBS has a 2020 report on the investments from code upgrades, code improvements, hardening, resilience upgrades, and it basically pays 4 to 1. That's the minimum return. Some of them are like 13 to 1. It's a hit piece, right? They're gonna the bigger the cost benefit ratio, the better the audience. But we'll at 4 to 1. 4 to 1 is a good return on your investment to go prevent something from being a problem later on. And I think we have a new report coming out this summer, maybe, that we can't talk about because we don't have it.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, yeah. There's an update coming. But the third part of the investment, I think, is culture. And so imagine you've got a dam, and downstream of the dam, you've got a power plant. 2 independently operated organizations. And the power plant says, I've got money, I need to do my maintenance repairs. But when you're doing budgeting, the dam says, we've got maintenance repairs that we need to do. And they're critical. And the power company says, well, I'm not going to give you any money for that. That's not my budget. That's fine. Upgrade your power plant. And when the dam fails, you lose your entire power plant, right? So we've got to look, and it's just reality, and it creates a waterfall of effects, right? The road washes out. You can't fix the power line until the road gets repaired. From a cultural standpoint, Mark Pastorella says, we got to check our ego at the door. And I'm an Army guy, so I'll tip my hat to the Marines. But General Berger in 2019 goes to the Marine Corps and says, all of our doctrine is out of date. It's terrible. And he tore the whole thing down. This is the Commandant of the Marine Corps. He took hits every single day. Worst decision ever. And the problem was, and the story is, if he's wrong, Marines pay the price. We're not talking infrastructure. We're talking Marines in combat. If he's wrong in changing their doctrine, the Marines pay the price. And if he's right, no one will notice. So culturally, how do we find the leaders in the industry, the one that's going to take the political hit, the political risk, and risk their career to force that transition? And the problem is, when the earthquake hits, when the fire hits, and the fire's put out, and the earthquake goes, well, yeah, that was a shaker, but everybody's still kind of going, and the resiliency's improved, and you don't have FEMA stepping in, you don't have the National Guard, you don't have all these crises. There's no re-election. You get re-elected by fixing the crisis or responding to the crisis. So that's kind of we talk about the call to action. Culturally, we need somebody to step up and say, we're willing to reallocate these dollars, fund these missions in order to prevent the bad outcome, that you can't prove the negative.
Yeah, that was very well put. I like that a lot. One example I just wanted to bring up too when we talk about some of these cascading effects and the Lifeline failures, because I moved to Asheville, so I wasn't there during all the hurricanes and things like that. But my neighbor is a park ranger, and I asked him when the road to Chimney Rock, which is like a national park, was going to open, and he's like, "It's not reopen. It's a new road. Like, there's nothing there to do. You're now building a new mountain road through very tough terrain." And I think that, when you were speaking, it just hit me that I was like, yeah, if some of this infrastructure can't make it through these disasters, it's not always going to be, oh, well, we're going to figure it out in 24 hours or 48 hours. It can be years, and I guess Route 1 in California was another example of that. Like, that took how long to repair. So anyways, that visual just popped in my head, and I wanted to share that. But as we dive into kind of this investment piece and the economic and societal value, Hannah, I'm hoping maybe you could frame this from your experience as well.
Okay. I have one like kind of pragmatic example, and then one other one where I try to convince people. A while ago, San Diego was successful in getting a $36 million grant from the California Transportation Commission. And one of the things that they did, it was in Del Mar Bluffs where the track goes along those cliffs that can degrade onto the track. And one of the things that they did to make them successful was that they estimated the cost of what it would take for them to repair the track if they had an event like that, and then also the cost of the rerouting of the service during the repair time. And then they included that in their benefit cost ratio, and they showed it as part of like their return on investment of the project. And so that helped them be successful in that grant. And then another thing is not so much like convincing, but getting the most effective or like a return on your investment once you have some investment, is that a few years ago I worked on a project with the CPUC where we took modelers from both Caltrans and the CPUC, and we made a map that looked at electric and transportation infrastructure together. We were trying to see where first to build zero emission freight infrastructure. And so doing that allowed us to see the locations where we had the most truck traffic and it was already close to existing electric infrastructure that would make it easier to build. So I think if you have investment too, there's ways that you can make your approach more efficient, and it usually involves looking at multiple systems together.
Michael, to you, same question about how can we improve this business case for investment in resiliency, and how is Southern California Edison looking at it?
Yeah, so we have to do that on a regular basis when we go for our general rate case, and we have to make the argument for the rates that we intend to charge, and so that is part of our practice. We have a geologist on staff that makes that case with our seismic retrofits and looks at the benefit of hardening that. Looking at some of the work, may be familiar with Keith Porter, and he talks about the investment that saves and reduces deaths, dollars, and downtime. And so we know that investment that we make has that effect on society because we want to save lives. Right, safety is very important for us in the hardening, both on the wildfire side as well as the seismic side. As Scotty mentioned, we know that there's a return on investment, up to at least 4 to 1, maybe 13 to 1, but we know that it does ultimately, save, the recovery cost on the tail end. But that is the challenge is making that case because. As Scotty mentioned, we don't see it until it occurs, and when it goes right, there's no necessary celebration of it. It's really when things go sideways that there's any type of concern, and then also on the side of lives, downtime. And then just the downtime, hardening our infrastructure ensures that we are able to get back to a sense of normalcy sooner. So that's really where we focus for Southern California Edison is on those practices so that we can, reduce any kind of effect to individuals' lives. Save the dollars, and then also, reduce the downtime when we do have something go sideways.
I guess I'm going to jump in. One, I think the 4 to 1, I didn't dive into the source data on the report. I'm assuming like the 4 to 1 is the direct cost, right? So we don't talk about the indirect costs when something happens. The water line breaks, that's the direct cost. It takes out the road, that's the indirect cost, or the associated cost with different departments. We know when the emergency happens, when the crisis happens, we've got FEMA, OES, everybody out there. They've done all the planning, plan A, B, C, D, and it's easy to prioritize. How do you help, and this is to Hannah and Michael, how do you go through the prioritization process before? Like on the annual budgeting basis, how are you prioritizing what the projects are to do this?
For me, on the wildfire mitigation, we have our high fire risk areas that we've identified. So, increasing the vegetation management there, covered conductors, being able to segment, circuits so that if we do the preemptive, the public safety power shutoffs, things along those lines that, the resiliency there isn't just the prevention, but also, keeps or reduces any kind of cascading effects. And so with the high fire risk areas, we've identified that with our infrastructure and our seismic. We have a tranching system where we've identified, the most critical resources that we have, whether it's substations or, transmission facilities. And so those are our emphases, data centers that we have, hardening the systems within there to ensure that, the racks are secured. So the non-structural hazards, those are some of the mitigation efforts that we take there. But we've invested significantly. We're almost up to $300 million on the seismic side in just hardening that infrastructure, and it's all been prioritized with a multi-year plan. Sometimes, based on situations, we have to switch things up a little and reprioritize, but it's really a joint effort with our subject matter experts, engineers, as well as we have a seismic specialist on staff, former USGS, Dr. Ken Hudnut, and he's done a fabulous job of really identifying and prioritizing those assets in the company that we want to begin to harden.
I'll say what the official process is, and then I'll say something I think gets to what you're trying to ask. Okay, so the most of our funds at Caltrans run through our SHOP program, and it's where most of the tax dollars go. And so those priorities are set by performance objectives. And then those performance objectives are prioritized, like safety is the first one. So that is the official system of how it's prioritized. And if you want to know more, you can go online and look at the State Highway System Management Plan. And then I also want to add, because this is important, that on the non-SHOP side of the house, which I would say is approximately 40% of our remaining funding, there's a ton of different buckets, and the priority is usually set by statute. So we're trying to follow that. But to get to what you said, my team does a lot of work with our design engineers, and we develop project features that they could include in the design phase for adaptations for various things. And the hard thing is that if you're going to adapt a project, if you're going to build it to be resilient upfront, it just increases the cost astronomically. And so are you going to do 2 really good projects in 1 year if you're in a district, or are you going to do 5 or 10 ones to maintain the bare minimum? That's the question they're always asking themselves. And I feel like what they choose depends on like a multiplicity of factors, like including how bad is their average maintenance that they got to do, and how much are they hearing from stakeholders about getting this resilient project done, and what are the values of their district directors. So it's kind of like this subjective decision-making process that happens. But I would say that as the scale of events keeps tipping more and more of these extreme like climate events and such, that I'm starting to see like this paradigm shift of decision-making where our leaders are starting to say, maybe I will do less projects that cost more and build that higher bridge or whatever. So
I think that hits the nail on the head. And a lot of times we're going to reduce the result. It's value engineering. No, it's not value engineering. It is scope reduction, right? Or it's a negative value proposition. It's saving money, but you're reducing the value of the project by 10 to 1. So the bureaucracy with the buckets of money, right? So that was kind of my point on the leadership. Who's going to say that bucket's not going to get any money? It's got to go over here because in 6 years when the earthquake happens, that overpass will stay.
So I'm just going to touch on something Michael said in terms of, or how do you articulate economic and social value? I think that's probably one of the harder challenges to really share with, people who are making the decisions. So, if you think in terms of the main objective of these investments for reliability and resilience, you're really trying to reduce disruptions, protect lives, and keep essential services running when people need it most. So that's the objective. But how do you articulate what that means in terms of those economic and social values? So when you think in terms of economic value, we want to make sure that we don't have this disaster become a catastrophe where it's compounding issues. So, for example, from an economic perspective, the critical services you want to be restored faster and quicker so that you're avoiding the compounded costs I think you were referring to earlier. So prolonged business closures or lost wages, supply chain disruptions, and extended emergency operations. We don't want to see U.S. Army Corps, I hope they're not in the room, constantly over a year, still doing debris removal. We want them in and out and done. And that impacts the recovery of the economy as well. From a social value perspective, faster restoration protects public safety and stability by keeping those essential services available. You have healthcare, water, communications, transportation access. This is all what the community relies on. So a secondary compounding effect is potentially you lose the people will move out of the area. We see this in the Palisades right now. We saw this Hurricane Katrina. People moved out of Louisiana. They went to Texas. You see that at the Palisades fire. People are moving out. We don't know if they're coming back. In Northern California, we had multiple wildfires, people moving out of the cities. That's a loss of tax base. So again, it circles back. They're all interconnected, compounding impacts between social and economic value here. So how do we show this value? Again, just going back to some of the other strategies we talked about earlier, making sure that we're understanding the value through the performance decisions and metrics that people are already using. Again, we're not trying to create these special projects. And then making sure that we have a strong business connection to resilience and public trust and continuity. We don't always think about what does it mean when a community can bounce back quickly. People have trust in that community, the leaders of that community, where if you can get your restoration of services back online faster, they see the value in those operators or in the community leaders. So if you have a strong track record of resilience, there's long-term economic stability and better reputational value for those communities. And why does that matter? Because it reframes resilience as a core service obligation, not just an upgrade. So that's why I think there's a lot of value in making sure we connect those dots so that the value is highest, again, when we reduce those cascading failures, because the biggest losses occurs when one lifeline disruption triggers failures across multiple systems and then prolongs that recovery process. And again, that disaster, and I'm going to say this multiple times, becomes more of a catastrophe.
Well, we're quickly running out of time here, but this has been an amazing conversation. So I think we're probably going to start doing the call to action. Unless, Jordana, did you get everything you wanted to get out for the? Okay, excellent. So let's start with Scotty, and then we'll go down the line. So hoping just a quick call to action, something that, if there's one take-home message that someone can do this year to move the needle, like what are our suggestions?
Well, I think every year, at the end of the year, I sit down and some people call them resolutions. I come up with goals, right? Goals for next year. How far am I going to run? How many books am I going to read? Get a job, that kind of stuff. Like that one. But this year, and on my whiteboard sitting in front of my computer, I've got written in bold green letters, highlighted in blue, is action. And I've been paralyzed by perfection as the enemy of progress, right? So just do something. Get out there and force the meeting, collaborate. So my call to action is go back, sit with your stakeholders and your leadership and get, whether it's OES or whatever your emergency or your planning committee is, and start facilitating the conversations between agencies about what can we do now versus after the earthquake, fire, etc.
So I think we do a relatively good job in coordinating across agencies during a response. think we're pushed together in the time of crisis to work together. You see this through ICS or emergency operations centers, and even mutual aid when states come together to support each other. I think we're a little less consistent when it comes to pre-disaster work and that planning piece and investment decisions across Lifeline. So they're formal frameworks between FEMA's community lifelines, hazard mitigation planning. It all supports a whole systems approach, but they're usually just applied in pieces and not in an integrated strategy. So I think the biggest opportunity here is really to look at those different structures and planning systems and bring it together with capital planning in the pre-disaster work so that we're not just coordinating during a crisis, like you were saying, but really investing ahead of time.
This is a DOT perspective, but I would say just think about the interdependencies of systems. When you're looking at a system, if you're working on an electric system, a transportation or water, just think about the other systems that surround it and maybe pull up a map of those so you can see what those interdependencies are. I think it will help your picture. And then just engage with your partners proactively, local, state, federal. I think that's really important.
Yeah, mine's definitely going to be an echo of what everybody said. Resiliency is a shared responsibility. And so, identifying those interdependent partners that you have and making those connections ahead of time. Great example right now, we have, about 100 of our employees and 70 some contractors that were on the road in about 36 hours on their way to Shreveport, Louisiana, to help with the recent storm. And that came about because of the relationships that were built ahead of time, planning for mutual assistance needs. And that's a great example of just emphasizing those relationships before something bad happens. To your point, we do great when things go south, but that is a challenge, is getting folks together. That's what we're trying to do with our Critical Lifelines work group. Ahead of time is get those folks together, identify those interdependencies, prioritize projects that we want to work on so that we are more resilient together.
Fantastic. That was really, really informative. I feel like all four of you really echoed each other's points throughout, which I like a lot. And a lot of it actually just keeps bringing me back to Sheriff Barnes too. Like, I think his point about some of the complacency, like, I think part of what I'm hearing here is like a challenge to that is like, let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. Let's find mutually shared areas and push forward. So really excellent. Let's bring the audience in for Q&A before we wrap up the session. Does anyone have any questions? It's a pretty small room, but I can run a mic over if we need. JQ.
We got 4, so we can share up here. And
I can also have pass over the mic. Great panel, thank you for the great discussion. Scotty, for one of your questions for the 1 to 13 number for the mitigation safes, those number does include the BI, also indirect BI. So we have all those analysis in. But that's a good point. So I
brought my own AI with me.
So this is a really great discussion for the collaboration across all the key stakeholders. I think that's common sense. When we talk about this, everyone agrees. When we look at the $13 saving for the $1 spending, that saving is to many different stakeholders. When we do the analysis, that's not only to one stakeholder, that's to the owners, right? To the local taxpayers, to the repairer, to the insurers, to everyone. So one thing we also try to advance, how we can pay for this, how we can bring in all the co-beneficiaries who will benefit from that, right? Everyone's kind of interested on the conversation. For all the action items we mentioned earlier, that's very important, how we can act together. It's common sense. So my question to the team in general, just when you try to bring everyone together, we need a leader, we need a champion. For the Caltrans, OES, South California Edison, Michael, great group for the work group. But who can be the champion when you have a CIP project for transportation or something else? who can be the champion to facilitate the conversation, make sure everyone in the table?
I think that's a request for Nibs to get involved and lead.
No, for this project, for this kind of project, should be some kind of local champions, either DOT themselves or AECOM or the consulting firm, right?
So I'm going to challenge that a little bit and say that you can't just have one champion. It has to be a group that everybody's coming to the table equally and has a seat at the table and a voice. Because if you have a champion, then someone's going to say, oh, they're responsible, they're in charge, right? So if you bring everybody together in a more integrated fashion and everybody has a role and has accountability, I think that's a better approach, that you have working teams and understand that we're all in this together. It's like when there's a disaster, everybody knows that they play a role. Everybody has to know that they're responsible.
Yeah, I'll add what we've done. I mentioned kind of the comprehensive approach that we take with the training and exercise. And one thing that we do annually for our large resilient grid exercise is we bring together a senior leader roundtable. And, through the discussion of whatever scenario it is, usually earthquake or cyber related or things that we focus on. But 2 years ago, we had our earthquake exercise with the senior leader roundtable. We have people at the table from Department of Energy, Cal OES, FEMA, and they become the champions, right? In that discussion, realize, and that's why we revitalized the work group, is the Critical Lifelines work group, because they recognize the need to re-engage and have those discussions, build those partnerships. And so, to Jordana's point, it's a collective effort. And so we use that opportunity with doing that senior leader roundtable to identify those things, and they become the champion and push the needle forward.
And I'll just quickly add, in my world, the people who have influence over a lot of money that I would try to get their attention is like some in Caltrans, but also like your big four MPOs, your associations, like your transportation associations, your big CBOs. If you can get their attention and get them to start talking about it, it's more likely that you'll start getting traction.
Great. Any other questions?
Thank you all for your time this morning. So I had a question. There were some great comments at the beginning about tying resilience efforts to like ongoing maintenance and capital improvement planning. And I 100% agree that that's the way to go. I think there's a large cultural hurdle to, that's why even the state and local estimated deferred maintenance backlog is, 87 million, which is just as of a few years ago. I imagine it's actually probably a lot higher than that. Are there things or discussions or thoughts on how to capture the cost of inaction, of addressing, resilience is often seen as a cost center and something that's just an added cost to just our ongoing operations. And maybe how can we change the narrative to have different organizations, whether it's the end users, insurance companies, consider the cost of inaction and try to tie incentives to that piece. I'd love your thoughts on that.
So I think I'm the one who said that. So I think it's the challenge, and I think you touched on it, is how do you identify the cost of inaction? I think that's your point. And I think it's very challenging. If you don't know what's about to happen, you can't say, here's the value of inaction. But I think in terms of scenario planning and understanding what potentially could happen, you have data that has happened before. So it's really more of a function of making sure that you're not creating these standalone programs, is what I think I mentioned earlier about when you pull it out of the capital planning process and you say, oh, it's just a resilience project, you're creating additional cost. So you're creating that additional cost, and then you don't know how to account for the unknown. So you're creating multiple barriers to the investment. So if you can incorporate it earlier on into the capital planning process, you're not creating those incremental costs as you're going along. So I think that's that's really, it's definitely a challenge. And I think this is one strategy that we've identified as a way of trying to get around that hurdle. Sure.
And I think if you, back to the insurance question, people approached me after the meeting and we talked about it. And insurance, all the insurance company have secret formulas, right? And they issue you guidelines about if you do this and you harden your home, you get X number of points. And if the community has a fire loop that does X, you get this many points. They often exclude the fire risk associated with forests. And if we can get them, like, why aren't we approaching them and having them come to us and say, what will make it insurable? Because if they leave, so we are you from the insurance industry?
Yes. I just saw the
I'm just talking like, but from an affordability standpoint, so all three of my grandparents, all three of their houses were lost in the Paradise Fire. They're already dead, so it didn't matter. But my sister lives in Colfax, which is up in fire country, and they're about to lose. You risk losing your insurance. Then you get the FAIR plan, which doesn't cover the cost of your house. So if the capital, if the market drove that, you would move to a housing crisis where houses have to be a cash basis because you can't insure it because of the fires. So that, I think, I'll defer to the insurance.
Sure, and I can add some comments to that. So I work for FM, so it's a factory mutual insurance. So less about the home insurance, it's more about businesses, right? And at FM, so I think what we believe in is that the majority of loss is preventable if you do something about it. But what is that specific thing that you can do, right? It has to be based on engineering, facts, and science. So that's exactly what we do. We make our clients more resilient to be able to withstand those natural disasters. And by making them more resilient, it actually becomes more of a opportunity and an advantage, right? I have an example. This is a manufacturer of grapefruit. They're located in Florida. Across the street is their competitor. A big hurricane came in. This facility that was built to resilience through engineering and research, hurricane passed by. It was a bad day, but they were back in business, squeezing juice, right, the next day, right? And then their neighbor, right, did not take adequate measures to protect the envelope of their building with adequate engineering. The building suffered significant damage, water damage. They were down for almost 6 months. Guess what happened to the business that was able to withstand? They gained that market share that their neighbor could not do. So when we see loss expectancies or losses, right, due to catastrophes, sometimes you see the insurance company, well, they're just going to pay the top of the iceberg, right? But when you look at the loss expectancy and the loss rate that comes with each of these catastrophes, there's a lot more that's underneath the water. There's reputation, there is potential loss of life, and like I said, that market share that you might be able to gain, right? Now that I'm drinking, brand A juice, I might stay with that and not go back to the one I was with before. So in regards to what can we do to make things more resilient, let's say from a fire perspective, there are things now in place that we can make our buildings more resilient to wildfire. So one thing is construction, right? If you pick the right construction materials, it's not going to burn. The other thing that I think you mentioned was clearing, zone of clearing, right? How far from the hills and what type of vegetation does it need to be clear? There's a lot of studies right now, and I think we need to do more studies, right? Because now we're getting into a point where the wind speeds are becoming a little bit too greater, that maybe the buffer zone shouldn't be 1,000 feet, but maybe it should be 3,000 feet, right? And how often do we need to be doing that? So we can talk more during lunch about the things that can be done to reduce the risk that will make it more insurable. And that's exactly what we do with our clients, right? If you reduce the risk, you get a better rate. So it's another way of ROI that comes into the plate there.
Great points, and you're talking within the building that's controllable by that insured, right? So then you're talking about the 3,000 feet. That's not their 3,000 feet.
Yes, and that's when you have to work together with your governmental agencies to get you there, right? And we also insure some governmental agencies where we can actually work together much easily. So.
Okay, we have another question from back here. This back right corner seems to be dominating the Q&A, so someone over here has to ask one.
Hi, really enjoyed the panel. I'm actually an academic. I work in computer science and look at data and AI. And I really liked the comment about sort of resilience being a shared responsibility, and that building these interdependencies and understanding them ahead of time is actually very useful. People share data very easily during disasters, perhaps, but how do you make this, and do you see barriers to sharing this kind of perhaps sensitive information about a building or a particular kind of infrastructure when you have to do this ahead of time for resilience planning?
I have one example of where we're trying to do that. We've been working with our legal on a data sharing agreement that we can have in place with the military, so that because the military systems are completely closed, and then when they have an event, they like set up a separate little bubble, but then it closes after that event. So what we're trying to do is create a legal agreement that would allow us to securely share certain levels of information in a shared space that won't close, and it can just stay open indefinitely. But the people who have access have to get authorized and such. So that's actually made it through our legal department, and it's going to go to, or no, my staff would kill me for saying that. Almost has made it, and it's going to go. So that's one thing we're trying to do is a data sharing agreement.
Is that an issue when you do this at community scale, when you have all these public-private partnerships that need to be established?
Yeah, we routinely, I've never had one quite like this, but we routinely have data sharing agreements that we sign when we do that.
Yeah, definitely a challenge, for us because of proprietary information, things along those lines. But it's where we can, building those relationships ahead of time, and then finding those partners that it's appropriate. So our security folks work closely with FBI, CISA, along those lines, and so they are able to, on the cybersecurity side, discuss things that wouldn't be with the broader audience, but still making those connections where we can, right? If we're talking about a cybersecurity incident, we may not get into the details of some of that more sensitive information, but we definitely can talk about, some of those cascading effects and how we can mitigate against those ahead of time with those partners.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. Coming from the private sector perspective, being in the middle of some of these public sector agencies, I mean, there's a lot of sensitive nature to the information that even they're sharing with us. Not alone, they don't want it out in the public. So I think starting from that perspective and making sure that we are very aware that it's very sensitive information on the critical infrastructure. Maybe years ago, people weren't thinking about that, but nowadays, people certainly are, for sure.
I think we have time for one more. Okay.
I used to be a marketing professor, and one of the things that hasn't been talked about much is getting the civilian, so to speak, person involved in these things. And it is not going to happen in one meeting or 2 meetings or 3 meetings. It's going to take 10 before people begin to realize I could do 2 really good projects or 5 kind of cheesy projects. So it has to have a patience built into this. What I would recommend thinking about is having some plans in place. The only time people listen to stuff is when they're hit over the head with something. So right after an event, people will go, oh gosh, what can I do? What can I do? That lasts for a month if you're not directly affected. People in LA have forgotten about the fire except for those that live in that area. I know my house burned in Laguna Beach in 1993. So for a while, everyone was very interested in that. And then a year later, no one cared except for the people who's lost their houses. So have plans ready to roll out into the community when people are open to the message. Save your money and your meeting times between, because no one's going to attend and no one's going to do anything about it. But if you have meetings about, oh, we need better resiliency, And if we're going to do these projects versus too many of these other ones, there'll be a receptive audience just after the event. And save your powder for those events.
Anyone want to respond? Yeah.
I would just say I agree, but I would say both and, right? We definitely, have that in your back pocket as a plan, but building those relationships ahead of time, it really is key, and I think there's a lot of good work that has been and will continue to be done when we develop those relationships. That is true. On the public sector side, we used to say disasters were good for business, because people listened after the earthquake, and we, did have concerted efforts with informational campaigns and outreach and everything to try to get people more prepared, partnering with businesses for preparedness kits, things along those lines. But I really do strongly believe it is a both and, right? Developing those relationships ahead of time, and then also having that messaging and more targeted, for more targeted opportunity. So.
Yeah, I would agree with your point about having pre-planned messaging, being able to roll out. But I think the challenge sometimes is that disaster survivors will only want to hear what they want to hear. So if you're trying to get a message to them and explain, the process takes time. I mean, I've seen this over, I don't want to say decades, but decades of different disasters, and it takes time. There's a process that you go through, and not everybody understands that or is willing to hear it. Because what they want to hear is, when am I getting back in my house? When are the services coming back? So therein lies a really difficult challenge to make sure that people understand, those expectations and what has to happen. But I agree with your point.
I think that is the end. We're out of time. Thank you so much for your attention. And I'm sure the panelists will be happy to have discussions out the rest of the day. Thanks.